The statements made by Belarus have made Putin very angry. Putin did not know what to do. While the situation in Belarus was getting more and more complicated, the Russian soldiers found themselves in a very difficult situation. If Putin loses this ally, he will be alone. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, began to take advantage of these disturbances to corner the Russian army. But Putin's decisions have resonated all over the world. In the last days of the Ukrainian-Russian war, the Russian army was faced with very big problems. That's why Putin started taking different steps. However, the Ukrainian army has added another one to the advantages it has gained. Putin, on the other hand, started to meet with many countries to find allies after these troubles. At the beginning of these countries was Belarus, but after these meetings with Putin, he was greatly disappointed. After that, the Russian soldiers began to get thoroughly cornered. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko expressed support for Putin in his statements, and he emphasized this in the words, "If you want peace, prepare for war." But when Putin created a new route to enter the Ukrainian region, the whole world stood up. Putin's statements caused great repercussions all over the world, but things were also getting increasingly complicated in Belarus. When opposition groups in Belarus began to rise up, Lukashenko's power also began to shake. After these recent developments, many opposition groups in Belarus have started to rebel. Belarus has recently been seeking to get closer to the West, but nevertheless, Belarus, acting bilaterally, began to conduct a secret mobilization after the defeat suffered by Russia. After this situation emerged, things began to get very complicated for Lukashenko. At the same time, when opposition groups in Belarus began to rebel, the aid to be sent to Russia began to pose a complete problem. The people who no longer support the Belarusian government have completely confused things. When the riots in Belarus started to grow every day, Putin's plans completely fell through. Putin's revenge plan was recently deciphered by Israel. In recent days, Israel has been providing serious information to the Ukrainian army in the field of intelligence. The most important of these was to decipher Russia's invasion plan. However, satellite images monitored by Israeli intelligence showed that Russia has sent a large number of troops to Belarus. Putin's move was now the last hope for soldiers in the Russian army. For Putin, this operation was very important. He even announced a new mobilization for this. This mobilization, announced by Putin, was the largest mobilization since the beginning of the war. Within the scope of this mobilization, about 500,000 soldiers would be included in the army. But a problem has arisen that Putin has never taken into account. The people of Belarus had begun to revolt. For a long time, opposition groups began to appear in Belarus. Many groups had formed that opposed Belarusian President Lukashenko, who was now pro-Russian. But while the whole world opposes this unjust invasion of Russia, Lukashenko's support for Putin has brought the Belarusian people to their feet. After that, a lot of actions and protests began to come decently. When the Belarusian people began to think that Lukashenko was now a dictator like Putin, they immediately rebelled and took to the streets. After these troubles, Putin predicted that there would be security problems in the region and began to question the invasion plan again. However, political impotence in Belarus would change all the balances of the war. These uprisings in Belarus had both stopped Putin's invasion plan and given Ukraine a great advantage. While Putin planned to completely invade Ukraine with this move, his plans soon fell through. After these developments, Putin did not know what to do, and the Russian army is thoroughly cornered. Taking advantage of this confusion, the Ukrainian army moved to organize a very large operation. The reason for this operation to be held has caused confusion all over the world. Since the beginning of the war, many supports had come to the Ukrainian army from the West. But the support given in recent days has confused everything. Almost all of the aid to the Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war was for Ukraine's self-defense, but most of the support that came to the Ukrainian army after the recent events was for Ukraine to end the war. However, in the latest statements from the Ukrainian front, the rhetoric that the Ukrainian army will end the war has started to rise. At the same time, the Ukrainian army had developed itself very much in many areas, especially in the field of intelligence. And he took action to deal a very big blow to the Russian army. The Ukrainian army began to develop in all areas. And he got in front of the Russian army. Thanks to the successful operations of the Ukrainian army, the morale of the Ukrainian soldiers was quite high. Thus, Putin's rhetoric at the beginning of the war was completely futile. At the beginning of the war, Putin had managed to occupy many regions, but after such a development of the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian soldiers began to drive out Russian soldiers on their territory one by one. The Russian soldiers, who are already having problems with ammunition and supplies, are thoroughly cornered. At the beginning of the war, Russia had taken many steps and succeeded. But after the development of the Ukrainian army, Russia began to lose all the advantages it had gained. Thanks to the successful operations of the Ukrainian army, Russian soldiers were forced to leave the region without even looking behind them. Thus, Russia began to use the ammunition and tanks left behind by the soldiers of the Ukrainian army. At the same time, this situation also shook the Russian economy. Turning this situation into an opportunity, the Ukrainian army has started preparing to strike a solid blow at Putin. Just before the operation to be organized by the Ukrainian army, very serious tank support came from many countries. These tanks were capable of changing the course of the war, and these tanks were incomparably better than Russian tanks in terms of modernization. Thus, the Ukrainian army would completely corner the Russian soldiers. Putin, on the other hand, claimed in his propaganda that the T-90s were much more powerful than the Abrams and Leopard 2s, but the data revealed showed the exact opposite. The Abrams tanks used by the Ukrainian soldiers were one of the greatest wonders of modern technology. These tanks had the power to almost blow up Russian tanks with a single shell, because these bullets were reinforced with uranium. After these developments, the Ukrainian army has put Russian soldiers in a very difficult situation. Because of the political impotence in Russia and Putin's aggressive attitude, many countries wanted the Ukrainian army to win. That is why the support to the Ukrainian army was increasing every day. At the beginning of the countries that supported the Ukrainian army were the G7 countries. The main desire of the G7 countries was not to disturb world peace and to strengthen the Ukrainian army more. However, at a meeting of the G7 countries, it was decided to impose new embargoes on Russia after Putin's threats. After these decisions, the problems experienced by Russia would increase even more. But Russia had much bigger problems now. They were experiencing a lack of ammunition, as Russian soldiers left a large number of weapons and ammunition in the area while fleeing Ukraine's operations. For this reason, they had to start using weapons and ammunition from the Soviet Union. However, the soldiers using rusty and outdated weapons and tanks could not achieve any success. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, did not have such a problem. Ukrainian soldiers were fighting with state-of-the-art weapons and tanks, while at the same time keeping their morale very high. After that, successive operations of the Ukrainian army made Russian soldiers unable to shelter in the region. After these developments, the comments made by war analysts resonated all over the world. According to the comments of war analysts, if Putin did not change his policies, it would become a matter of time for Ukraine to win the war. If Russia loses the war, Russian President Vladimir Putin may come to the complete end of his power and political career.